Welcome everyone. Kindly note that during the course of the program, all the participants will be muted. In case of any query, please type it in the chat box. A very good morning to all. We have gathered today on this online platform for the fifth session of Look Ahead, which is a series of lectures and workshops organized by Dayapuram Arts and Science College for the benefit of the student community to sail through the current COVID 19 situation and establish their career goals. Now, I welcome Mr. Vipin C., Head of Physics Department, Dayapuram Arts and Science College, for the welcome address.
Hello, good morning. Myself Bikram, Head of the Department of Physics, Dayapuram Arts and Science College for Women. Thinking with Physics. A talk as a part of Look Ahead program during this pandemic season. So, my part in this program is to convey the welcome speech to all. Before starting the welcome speech, I would like to say a small quote which is stating like this: yesterday is a history, tomorrow will be a mystery. So we call today as present, which means a gift. This quote has several significance in present situation during this corona pandemic. We all are extremely thankful to the prime potential, which we all label as God, for keeping us safe till now and beyond. I would like to start my welcome speech. First of all, I welcome our beloved patron, C.T. Abdul Rahman Sir, in his absence, to this program. Next, I welcome Dr. M.M. Bashir, Chairman of Dayapuram Women's College, to this program in his absence. Next, I welcome our beloved speaker, chief guest of this session, Dr. Bikram Phookun, Associate Professor, St. Stephen's College, New Delhi, to this program. Next, I welcome our beloved principal, Dr. Srividya, to this program. Next, I welcome the college volunteer in charge, Dr. N.P. Ashley, Associate Professor, St. Stephen's College, New Delhi. I would like to welcome the coordinator of Look Ahead program, Twinkle, to this program. And I would like to welcome my colleagues of Physics Department and other departments to this program. Importantly, I would like to welcome all listeners and thinkers of Dayapuram and other campus to this program. My heartily welcome to all. Let's utilize this small piece of time to share and earn our perspective about physics and its new trend. Actually, this topic is a bit mixture of all branches. Physics is not an isolated branch of learning. Physics is everywhere, and I hope every listeners in this program will understood this. So I welcome all to this program. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next, I invite Aisha Riham of 3rd Sem BSc Physics to introduce the guest.
Good morning, everyone. Our guest of the day is Dr. Bikram Phookun. Dr. Bikram Phookun is the Associate Professor in the Department of Physics at St. Stephen's College, New Delhi. He has been teaching at St. Stephen's since 1996. He holds a PhD in astronomy from the University of Maryland at College Park.
Thank you, Aisha. Now, we have come to the most awaited part of the program. Let me request the guest of the day, Dr. Bikram Phookun, to address the students.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I think my video is a little blurred. I'm not sure I can do anything about that. That's okay. You don't need to see my face. Uh, Even if it's a vague outline, it's okay. So when Ashley asked me to give this talk, that was some weeks ago. He said, why don't you collect some questions from your students about physics, not about the subject of physics, but about doing physics. And I guess a few days ago, he sent me a few questions, and I've sort of given them names. Okay. So there are essentially 5 questions, which I'm going to answer, try to answer point-wise, and try to weave into a narrative. One is about imagination in physics, the role of imagination and how to develop it. One is about the intricacy of physics and how to cope with that, which is a very relevant question. A third question is about the love of physics and how to nurture it. The fourth question is about the difficulty of physics and how to tackle it. And the fifth question is about going beyond the syllabus and whether it's advisable or not. So I was asked by Ashley to speak for about 45 minutes and then take questions. So I'll try to limit myself to I'll try to finish by about 10:45. Okay, it's about 10:07 now. So let me begin. I'm going to begin by talking about imagination, which is a very, very dear subject to me. I mean, something that I think is of enormous importance in physics and which is often completely neglected. Okay. And the role of imagination in physics is paramount. It's, of course, paramount in all subjects, but I like to think that it is especially important in a subject like physics. And the reason that a lot of people outside physics tend to imagine that physics requires no imagination, it just requires skill, is that this imagination is actually very, very straitjacketed. There's this great physicist by the name of Richard Feynman who said that physics requires imagination in a straitjacket, meaning that you can't just let your imagination flow. Okay? It's got to flow within some confines, and the confines are the laws of physics. Okay? And so while there's a lot of space for your imagination, there are also an enormous number of constraints on this imagination. And if you think about anything that leads to real creation, whether it's poetry or music or dance or art, generally it's a coming together of constraints and of freedom. Okay, so there's liberty, which comes from the imagination, and there are certain constraints that come from the discipline. There is a tendency, especially among young people, to imagine that liberty alone can lead to creativity. I don't think this has ever happened. Liberty alone never leads to creativity. It is always the coming together of liberty and constraint that leads to creativity. So the role of constraints is very, very pronounced in physics, but these are very wide constraints. Okay, they leave open enormous scope to the imagination. So a great theoretical physicist is a creature of enormous imagination. It would be impossible for him or her to do theoretical physics without a lot of imagination. I'm emphasizing this, even belaboring this point, because people who are just beginning to do physics or are overwhelmed by its difficulty and intricacy often tend to imagine, oh, all this maths, how am I going to do all this stuff? It's so boring. I thought imagine physics was this wonderful subject about black holes and cosmology. But no, it's not just about things that you can love without really diving deep into them. These are things that require a lot of understanding of the laws of physics, okay? A sort of integration of the laws of physics into. So what do I do? I mean, this is all very well. The question is, what do you do in the classroom to inculcate this imagination in your students if you're a teacher, and to develop it if you're a student? What do you do? I think one of the most important ideas in physics, as in any other kind of discipline, is to begin by noticing things. Okay? And one of my favorite words in the class is notice. I will almost never write down an equation and start solving it. Okay? I might write down an equation describing a system, or I will get the students to develop the equation describing a system. And then I will ask them to make observations about the equation. Okay? I want them to notice what the equation potentially contains. Of course, just by looking at it, you're not going to be able to discover everything that is contained in an equation. An equation is something very compact and contains an enormous amount of information about the universe in general. For example, if you take Maxwell's equations or Newton's laws or the laws of general relativity or the laws of quantum mechanics, what is contained in one equation is a whole universe. And one doesn't expect people to be able to understand the entire universe of possibilities just by looking at the equation. But I think what often happens is that when one sees an equation, one tends to want to immediately start solving it. And that's, I think, the wrong track. What you should do is step back and ask yourself, what could this equation possibly contain? At least let me understand it superficially, if nothing else, so that at every stage you begin to notice. So this noticing is a very, very important. And once you begin solving an equation, so for example, I'm teaching quantum mechanics now, and we're solving the Schrodinger equation all the time. When you solve the Schrodinger equation, for example, in quantum mechanics, to give you a very concrete example, a very, very rich equation, you'll find that your solution corresponds to the system that you're describing. And of course, the first step is trying to see if there is this correspondence between the equation and the solution to the equation and the system that you're trying to describe. But also there's something that is often not, maybe emphasized enough in the undergraduate classroom, which is that you need to explore limits of the system. You need to ask yourself, how far can I take it? I've got this solution. How far can I take it before it begins to describe some other situation? Maybe some other situation that I'm already familiar with. Does it connect with that? Okay. And this idea of exploring the limits of what you have discovered is a very, very important idea, especially because often when you're exploring limits and you're exploring other possibilities, you tend to get lost. And you might think that, as a student, one of the worst things that you can imagine happening to yourself is getting lost. But one of the best things that can happen to a scientist is to get lost. Okay. There is almost never any act of creation unless the person is first lost. And to imagine that you can create something new, something wonderful, something extraordinary, being certain every step of the step is to completely misunderstand the process of creativity. When someone like Schrodinger, for example, discovers Schrodinger's equation, he had no idea what he was doing in some sense. If you read his papers, you'll get the feeling that he was totally lost. And yet not completely lost. Even in the middle of the darkness that he was in, he was able to find his way somehow, okay, and create something of lasting value. And this is very, very important. It's important for students to try to replicate this process at their own level. Okay. And this, again, is something that I try to emphasize a lot to my students, and I think is very, very difficult to get across, especially in our country. I say this especially in our country because we are taught to head straight for the solution. Okay? In any physics course in school, almost the only thing you are taught is how, the moment you see an equation, to find the solution. That is what will get you into the IITs, that is what will get you into BITS, but that is not what will get you a Nobel Prize, that's for sure. Okay? So, heading straight for the solution the moment you see a problem is a skill of a rather low level. Okay. I don't disparage this skill altogether, but it is not the end of physics, nor is it the end of any kind of academic discipline. Okay. The idea is to begin somewhere, to get lost, to find your way from that lostness, and in the process discover what you were trying to find maybe, and something else that you had never hoped to find, and maybe also discover what you're capable of doing. And this is something that is great importance to students of physics, because one of the most common problems among students of physics is lack of confidence. I mean, physics is an enormously difficult subject. I'm going to come to that. All of us will agree. I mean, I have been teaching physics for the past 24 years. I was a student of physics before that. I still find it extremely difficult. Okay? Physics is an extraordinarily difficult and demanding subject. And therefore, it is also very, very disheartening. Okay? And it will continue to dishearten you until you can discover your own capacity to navigate through it. Otherwise, you'll always be reaching out for someone else's hand to hold. You're just always trying to hold somebody's hand and be led. And if that is your goal, that's fine, but that's not going to get you very far. Okay, it might get you the first rank in the university, but it's certainly not going to get you the capacity to make discoveries on your own. So if you want to make discoveries on your own, even at a very small level, forget about, discovering Schrodinger's equation or the general theory of relativity. Even if you just want to discover the solution to a problem that is at the back of your textbook, you need to give yourself the chance to make that discovery. And I find that far too often, we don't give ourselves that chance. Okay? We don't give ourselves that chance because we're terrified of getting lost. And we're terrified of getting lost, partly because of the system we are in. Our teachers are constantly telling us to find the solution, find the solution, find the solution. And that's all we concentrate on. Okay? We want to find the solution. And we want to declare to the whole world that we found the solution to the problem. But that is hardly the point. The solution exists. Like I always tell my students when they run to me and tell me that G is 9.8 meters per second, I remind them that NASA is not waiting for this. It's already known to NASA that it's 9.8 meters per second. This result is not new. So the only purpose of the exercise is for them to learn something in the process. If all they can do is get me a result that already exists, then the whole purpose is lost. Okay? And I think this is something that really, really needs to get across. It's very, very difficult to accept this because we're so used after 14 years of schooling, 2 years of nursery KG and 14 years in a regular Indian school, so used to being congratulated for finding the correct answer, that's all we want from life. We want to find one correct answer after the other. So we are terrified of making mistakes. And I've seen this, 24 years in St. Stephen's College, I've seen this every day of my teaching life. We're all terrified of making mistakes. For example, I'm making a presentation right now. I would not want to make a fool of myself in front of all of you. Okay? Even though the consequences for the world and for me will not be very grave if I make a fool of myself. But the point is we are hardwired not to want to make a fool of ourselves in public. But in spite of that hardwiring, in spite of this very, very, very strong instinct not to want to make a fool of yourself in public, unless you're willing once in a while to make a fool of yourself, unless you're willing once in a while to make a mistake, unless you're willing once in a while to expose yourself, you're not going to make any progress. It's just impossible to learn how to do anything on your own if you're always on safe territory. You've got to expose yourself once in a while. And a classroom in a college is a very wonderful and safe space to do this. Because your teacher, no matter how critical, your classmates, no matter how critical, are your friends. Okay? They're a safety net under you. If you don't develop the ability to take risks while you are an undergraduate, you will find it very, very difficult to develop that ability later. Because once you're out in the world, those observing you will not be your friends. So make mistakes. And remember that let me compare the process of answering a question in two different ways. One is the teacher asks a question. You immediately provide the answer. You know the answer or you can immediately work it out. At the moment you give the answer, this is something you ought to notice. Everybody else in the class stops thinking. You give the answer, the whole process of thinking and all the other brains in the neighborhood get short-circuited. Nobody thinks anymore because the answer is out. Now let's contrast this with what happens if you make a mistake. If you make a mistake, then the others feel, oh, that person who's supposed to be a bright student has made a mistake. That means it's okay for me to make mistakes. Okay. because I was also slightly confused about this. So everyone immediately realized that, so they become part of the process. And you bring everyone in by making that mistake. And secondly, if your teacher is skillful enough and doesn't immediately give you the answer, but instead provides you hints, you get a chance to work your way out of that mistake. And in the process of working your way out of that mistake, you learn how that mistake could have been made, and you learn how to correct a mistake, which is far more valuable than just knowing the correct answer. And finally, after the process is over, you'll have the correct answer too. So in some sense, making a mistake in a class is a very, very valuable exercise. And this is something that needs to be encouraged all the time. I'm not saying that I'm perfect and I always encourage making mistakes. Sometimes I'm in a very bad mood and someone makes a mistake, I just snap at them. Okay? But most of the time, I make it a point to sort of encourage people to make mistakes, to recognize that these are interesting starting points. So in physics, those of you who are writing computer programs will know that there are certain kinds of programs in which you provide a starting point and then the program works its way to a solution. Okay. So one should think of an answer to a question that is asked in the classroom as a starting point rather than the solution. And once you iterate your way to the solution, you will learn a lot, and so will everyone else around you. Okay. So this is a very, very important thing in the process of developing your imagination. And the final point I want to make, I could go on and on about imagination. I could give a whole talk about imagination, but let me just move on to the other things. One very, very important way of looking at physics, or of anything else in life, in fact, okay, is stepping back from the problem. Meaning that the moment you're given a problem, generally your tendency is to rush at the problem and butt your head against it. And there's this very famous person called Polya, George Polya, who wrote a book called How to Solve It. It's about how problem solving. And he says, if a chicken sees a fence, he rushes at the fence. If a human being sees a fence and wants to get to the other side, he steps back from the fence and looks around to see if there's a gap somewhere. Okay. So what we really need to do, and I find that I often find that when given a problem, a very large number of students behave like chickens, meaning that they rush at the problem. Don't rush. There's no hurry. No one is waiting for your solution. Step back, relax, look at the problem, notice what it offers, examine it, think about it, mull over it, then look for something to do. Okay. This is a very, very difficult kind of skill to develop, that you need to step back and look at. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about imagination, because there's lots to say about other things as well. And this will segue into intricacy. Now, everyone will admit that physics is an extraordinarily intricate subject. It's just, physics and mathematics are probably the most intricate of the sciences, in that the number of things you need to apparently have to master to get anywhere is just enormous. Okay? And in some sense, it is like learning music, or learning to dance, or learning any kind of complex skill. Okay. Interestingly, most of us do not expect learning music or learning how to dance to be easy. We sort of acknowledge from the beginning that, you know, it's going to be intricate, it's going to be a long journey. But for reasons that are not completely clear to me, perhaps it's the way physics is taught in school and presented in school, we get the impression, because it's a solution-first approach to physics, we get the impression that somehow if we don't immediately get it, there's something wrong with us. In other words, we don't acknowledge the intricacy of the subject and the fact that there will be many steps before we can actually reach our destination, whatever it happens to be. So this is a very, very important thing to acknowledge at the beginning, that it's intricate. And then to realize that it's not going to be easy, and therefore we're going to have to work very hard. Physics is very, very tough for someone like me. I mean, I've been teaching it for so many years, I find it extraordinarily difficult. Okay. Can you just give me a second? My computer is, I need to get a charger for my computer. I see it's discharged. Just give me 1 minute. So there are a number of things that you can do. I mean, these are just tips, actually, to get used to the intricacy of physics. One, of course, is just work hard. But working hard is not enough. That's the point. Just working hard without thinking about it is not going to get you anywhere. You've got to work in a reflective way. In other words, you should constantly keep referring back to what you're doing, just as a good musician will do, or a good footballer will do, or a good dancer will do. You know, you've heard about how cricketers watch tapes of their own performance and then they discuss the moves and correct the moves. In some sense, that's what you need to do. You need to reflect on what you've done and correct your moves. Otherwise, you fall into bad habit patterns. Okay? You do things the wrong way repeatedly, over and over and over again. Okay? And so you need to work with reflection, and preferably, sometimes it's difficult for you to reflect on your own work. Then you should, you know, be open to criticism from others. And that's also very difficult. When a teacher says you should have done something differently, you feel hurt. But remember, being hurt is not something that will damage you for life. It's not like you're going to suffer the consequences of being hurt for that moment for the rest of your life. On the other hand, if you're able to take on board the suggestions the person is making, that may actually improve things for a very, very long time. So I think we tend to be very, very fragile when it comes to accepting criticism. We all are, okay? We're just human beings. But if you want to deal with the intricacy of physics, you need to find some way of reflecting. Either you should be able to reflect on yourself, or you should be able to find ways of accepting the reflections of others on your work. Another thing that is very, very useful. See, when studying physics, someone is, say, solving the harmonic oscillator or something like that. What do? They open a book and they follow what is written in the book line by line. That's the standard practice. That's what people do when it comes to studying for physics. Or they look at their notes and they write down line by line what has been. Okay. In other words, essentially what you're trying to do is memorize what someone else has already done. And this is also the way we take notes in class. Whatever the teacher writes down on the board, we write down line by line, word for word in our notebooks. Okay. And one thing that I tell my students always is, look, when you're writing down, you need to look down at your book. So for that moment, you lose contact with the board. All you have to do is make one tiny change in habit. Instead of copying, as you look down, try to imagine what's on the board and try to reconstruct it and then check. And that will make a huge difference, because then every moment is a creative moment. You're trying to reconstruct the argument instead of just copying the argument down. Okay. Similarly, if you're using a book, if you use it like, you know, some kind of holy book and you just sort of read it word by word, it's not going to get you very far. But if I want to develop my capacities, I might read something and then I put it away and I try to work it out on my own. I know it's very scary to try to work something out on your own. Okay. But unless you're willing to do this, it's very difficult to get used to the intricacy of physics, because what often happens is you figure out one intricate path to one solution, but you're unable to deal with the intricacy of physics as a whole. So you figure out how to get to the top of one mountain peak by a path that is well known to you, but if you're put in front at the bottom of any other mountain, you can't get to the top because you don't know how to find your way to the top. Okay. So if you want to deal with the intricacy of physics, you've got to acknowledge that it's difficult and find ways of improving your skills rather than your memory. There's too much emphasis on memory and too little emphasis on your ability to do things on your own. So once again, it comes back to the same thing. You know, you've got to do things on your own. And sometimes if something is very, very difficult, one very useful skill, again, this is an act both of the imagination and of development of the ability to deal with intricacy, is to build a simpler version of the problem. Many of the problems that we are expected to solve in physics are extremely complicated, but there are simpler versions of those problems. So for example, if it's a three-dimensional problem, maybe you want to first try out the problem in one dimension, see where it goes, then increase it to three dimensions. Okay. So these are things that you should this is something that you can't be expected to learn entirely on your own as a student, but these are the kinds of things that teachers could do in the class. Okay. Sort of inculcate the habit of looking at simpler models first and then going to more complicated models, and how to find more complicated models from simpler ones. This is something that, you know, really sort of needs to become part of the everyday training in physics. Unfortunately, too much of what happens in the classroom, too much of what happens in textbooks is clear solutions to clear questions, later repeated, often not very clearly. Okay, so you have a question very clearly posed to which someone has written down a very clear solution. You learn it to the best of your ability, and then later on you try to sort of spew it out. And in that process, you make a few mistakes, and you're ashamed of yourself because you couldn't remember the solution perfectly. But the whole emphasis is wrong. The idea is not to remember what somebody else has done completely. The idea is for you to develop your ability to do the same thing. If all we can do is keep reproducing what other people do, then we're not getting very far. Okay, we might crack exams, we might pass the NET exam, become teachers, even get a PhD, but it doesn't take you very far. Like I said, you've got to expose yourself, be willing to accept that ultimately the problem has to be solved with your brain, not with somebody else's brain. Very difficult thing to accept. Okay, whatever brain you have, you've got to use that to find the solution. What we're constantly doing is hoping that somebody else's brain will solve the problem and we can claim it. That's fine. So long as passing exams is all, if the goal is simply to pass exams, do well, that's fine. That'll work perfectly well. But I'm looking at it from a more fundamental point of view. I mean, if you want to go and do a PhD in physics at a place like TIFR or some good American university, this is not going to work. It's just simply not going to work because you're going to find that ultimately you'll be exposed. Ultimately, when your professor or your guide gives you a problem to solve, a big problem to solve that has never been solved by anybody in the history of mankind, then there's nothing to look up. There's no solution available anywhere. What are you going to do? So the only thing to do is to develop this ability while you're an undergraduate and you're doing your MSc. These are the only years in which you will get a chance to do this. Nobody is going to wait around for you to develop these abilities later. They will to some extent up to your PhD, but beyond that, after that, you're on your own. Okay, let me come to the third thing, which is again a very, very important thing, okay, which is the love of physics. Now, I want to say something about the love of physics, which might turn you all off. Okay. I've had a lot of students tell me, quite a few students tell me that before they came to St. Stephen's College, they loved physics. But once they started doing physics, they started hating it. Now, if you think about it, this is not too dissimilar from what happens in the process of love between two people often. Okay? When you see that person from a distance, oh, how wonderful, romantic, and all of that. When you get to know the person, man, you want to run in the other direction. Okay? And that's because the reality is often very different from our imagination of it. And our imagination of something that we know will be rewarding is often a kind of Disney-fied version of the reality. What we're thinking of in the first stages of love is big hearts, Archie's cards, all that nonsense. And there's the exact equivalent in physics. When you're in school and you think you love physics, you're imagining, changing the laws of physics. You want to understand the universe, change the fundamental laws, rediscover quantum mechanics, unite quantum mechanics. All of this is wonderful. It feels so good to imagine yourself doing that. I've gone through the same thing. But to be able to even begin thinking about physics, it turns out you first have to learn how to solve problems in mechanics, then electricity and magnetism, then thermodynamics, then quantum mechanics, then statistical mechanics. There seems to be no end to all of this. And people get, they get desperate. It's like, when are we going to get to the real thing? But the point is, this is the real thing. It's like learning. I know several of you, I know people in South India are much more culturally attuned than people in North India. I'm sure many of you learn music and dance and things like that. I am 100% sure that nobody starting out in the careers, starting out to learn dance or music ever imagines that they will begin to sing or dance like some kind of master from the next day. Nobody imagines that. Okay? They know it's going to be a long process. Nobody imagines that they're going to become a great footballer or a great badminton player or tennis player in 1 year. It's going to take 10 years to become a great player. Well, it's going to take 10 years to become a physicist. It's not going to happen in 6 months or 1 year. It's not going to happen in 3 years. It may just begin to happen. So the best thing that you can hope for is that you see some signs of improvement, and that you are in an environment in which others provide you the encouragement you need to last this process. This is a long process. It's not, I mean, don't imagine that you join physics and next day you'll start solving. You might have heard some romantic stories about some great people who did it. There are always prodigies, but most of us are not prodigies. We are ordinary people with ordinary brains. It's going to be a long journey, and you should accept the journey at the beginning. That is part of loving physics. If you're unable to accept that it's going to be a long journey, that it's going to be, fraught with difficulty, if you're unable to accept physics as it is, then you're going to find yourself very uncomfortable in it. So when you're unaccepting of another person, whether it's a friend or, your girlfriend or boyfriend, you find yourself very uncomfortable with that person after a while. You just can't handle it because the reality doesn't match your imagination. Okay? And it's the same thing with anything, any damn thing, whether you want to learn physics, dance, music, swimming, you've got to accept that these are not things that can be acquired in a day. These are not things that you're going to just love. You're going to, there's a process in loving physics. And and the initial stages, unfortunately, are very easy. That's what I call easy love. It begins with easy love, and then it becomes very, very tough. And the question is, can you get past that stage? Can you get past the stage of tough love to the point where you're comfortable with the subject and you accept that this is what it is and this is what I can do with it? Okay. You've got to find a relationship with physics. So unless you reach the point where you have a relationship with the subject, you haven't really begun to love the subject. You have very false ideas about it. Okay. So this is a long process. Like I said, everything is a long process. Okay? According to me, there's nothing that is simple. Unfortunately, this is not entirely true. That's the problem. There are prodigies. I've seen prodigies in physics. I've seen students in first year in physics who seem to understand the subject more naturally and more deeply than I do after many years. What do? There are prodigies in every area, but it's not just the prodigies who can do great work. Most of the great work in physics and in any other science was done by non-prodigies. People who worked hard, went through the process, became great scientists and great thinkers. Are you willing to be that? If you're a prodigy, great for you. More power to you. Okay, wonderful. If from day one you understand things very naturally, then you won't have any of these problems. But I've seen maybe 2 or 3 such people in my life. I mean, there are very few people of this kind. Okay, so that is not our model. Our model is a normal human being who will go through difficulty, find love in the subject. And it's important to love the subject. I mean, for example, the reason I'm very interested in teaching is that I love teaching. Okay? It would not be possible for me to survive in this career for so many years with so much enthusiasm if I did not love the profession, if I didn't love the act of teaching. Similarly, you cannot survive in something as difficult as physics unless you love it. And that love is very, very important to develop. But it's important to understand that it's not going to be easy. It's going to be tough, and you'll find that it develops with everything else. So let me come to the last thing, which is the difficulty of physics. I've been emphasizing this over and over again, so in some sense, this is just a summary. Okay? Yes, according to me, I'm sure there are people who disagree with me, physics is a staggeringly difficult discipline. I mean, it's just incredibly difficult. I face it every day as I prepare for my lectures. Every day I try to do something and I get lost. Every single time I prepare for a lecture, I get lost. Okay? Because I'm trying to do something on my own and I get lost. And I wish I could share all this lostness with my students so that they would feel, okay, it's okay to be lost. Because if you work hard enough, you'll get there. So you've got to accept that physics is very difficult. And I think there are a number of things that make it very, very difficult. One is that the mathematical requirement, the requirement of language is very, very deep and demanding. I mean, you can't do anything easily in physics because the mathematics is very complex. And secondly, the concepts are extremely deep, sometimes utterly incomprehensible. And what makes it worse is that you not only have to understand the subject conceptually, understand the subject mathematically, you got to marry the two. The physics and the mathematics have to come together. That is what makes it so difficult. You write an equation down and then your student says, ma'am, what does it mean? What does it mean? Maybe you hadn't thought about it. Or you explain a concept, you see it's like this. Or sir, what's the equation for that? Oh, what's the equation for that? So unless you sort of are constantly interpreting your mathematics and turning your physics into mathematics, it's not going to go very far. So it's very, very difficult. It's also very difficult because it requires so much imagination. Like one of my students once said to me, he's just throwing his hands up in the air. He says, this requires too much imagination. You know, I wanted them to do something in electricity and magnetism, and I never just derive things on the board. I sort of talk them through something, and I ask them to imagine things all the time. I keep asking them if they can see the movie in their head. Okay. And you know, at some point you get frustrated. What is all this nonsense? Am I here to imagine things? Am I here to become a great physicist? Well, unfortunately for most of us, imagination plays a very, very important role in understanding physics. So that makes it very difficult. The intricacy makes it very difficult. The vastness makes it difficult. There's just so many things. You feel defeated. You feel like, how am I ever going to learn all these things? Quantum mechanics, electricity and magnetism, statistical mechanics, thermodynamics, mechanics, Goldstein, God, it just seems too much. Okay, and the journey doesn't seem to end. These are things that make, so how are you going to survive? Well, you're going to survive in exactly the same way as you would survive in a relationship with a very difficult person, which is by developing love. Unless you love it, unless you really, really enjoy this stuff, you're not going to be able to do it for the rest of your life. You cannot have a relationship of hatred and animosity towards the subject and hope that somehow you will become a great scientist. It's not going to happen. So developing love, and that comes with accepting its difficulty, all its requirements of imagination, intricacy, hard work, whatever, is all part of one process. You've got to do all of it together. You can't do one thing separately from the others. You've got to love it for what it is, and you can only love it for what it is if you accept the intricacy, if you accept that it requires a lot of imagination, if you accept that you're going to have to work very, very hard, that it's going to be a long process. All of these things, when you accept and you are fully engaged in it, then you can, deal with the difficulty of physics. Otherwise, forget about it. It's not something, if it's unpleasant and it's constantly, relentlessly unpleasant to you, of course, there will be moments of unpleasantness. That's part of the process. But if it's always, always unpleasant, never, ever does it become pleasant, then you're probably doing the wrong thing. For example, if someone makes me play basketball, it's unpleasant every second because I have absolutely no idea what to do with the ball when it comes to me. So I should not be playing basketball. I know that. But it's important to give yourself the chance to discover whether you're good enough. And I would say this especially to the female students, because I find that they're much more critical of themselves than the male students. And because they're much more critical of themselves than the male students, they tend to undermine themselves much more at the beginning. At the beginning, you somehow need to imagine that you're going to be able to get past this initial stage and find a relationship with physics. And you've got to have that confidence in yourself, and you've got to listen to others. If your teacher says, look, I think you're good enough, you've got to accept that even if you have doubts all the time. Okay? So that is very, very important. So it's important not to have unrealistic ideas either in the positive direction or in the negative direction. Some of the boys often tend to have unrealistic ideas about their capacities in the other direction. Without doing any work, they somehow imagine that they'll be able to solve all the problems in the world. This is a peculiarly male problem. Okay? I mean, I've almost never come across a female student with this problem. Yet, I have come across hundreds of female students who, in spite of being extremely capable, will constantly keep saying, no, I can't do it, I can't do it, I can't do it. Okay, this is part of a larger social problem, but you got to solve it for yourself. Okay? So it's very important for you to recognize that if you feel you're incapable of doing physics right at the beginning, it may not be your problem, it may be a societal problem. Okay? And if it's a societal problem, it's not for you to solve. You're part of the solution, but it's not entirely for you to solve. Okay, let me quickly cover the last thing. I've reached 10:45, I've done 40 minutes. I'll just give you 5 more minutes on going outside the syllabus. Now, it depends on what you want from your course. Do you want a degree to go on to do an MBA or to enter industry? Then maybe you don't need to go outside the syllabus. Is your syllabus so good that even if you're interested in physics, if you cover everything that's in your syllabus, that you're well prepared for, you know, a graduate program in TIFR or a good university elsewhere? Then again, you don't need to go outside the syllabus. Okay. But if your syllabus doesn't cover everything that, you know, is expected of you when you enter graduate school in TIFR or IISc or one of these standard good places in India, then maybe you do need to go a little further beyond your syllabus. Also, as a general practice, as part of this process of opening up to your own possibilities and the possibilities of the subject, it's a good idea once in a while to step beyond the syllabus, which is after all your zone of comfort. The whole idea is you should be able to step outside your comfort zone once in a while. Okay. So are you able to do that? It could be a part of that exercise, exploring something new. Okay. But otherwise, there's no general formula for how much you should go outside the syllabus. When I'm teaching a course, for example, I usually cover the syllabus, but I might do extra things. Okay. So I cover the syllabus because the Delhi University syllabus is actually all said and done, though badly organized, a good course. It's a good syllabus. It covers most of the essentials. So I feel comfortable doing that. But if for some reason the syllabus were much poorer, then I would supplement it. Okay. So it's a matter of judgment. There's no straight answer to this question. Anyway, let me stop here. It's 10:47, and let me take questions, if any, from you.
Thank you, sir, for the valuable information you shared. Now, we are moving to the interactive section. So if anybody has any questions, please type it in the chat box.
Asking the first question is always very tough. So someone brave will have to do it. It almost doesn't matter what the first question is, because that sets the process rolling. So let's ask something. So sometimes, for example, if there's a talk in the physics department, I find that none of the students are asking a question. I'll ask something just to set the process rolling, and then they begin asking questions. Actually, why don't you ask me a question? How can we discover our abilities? Well, you can discover your abilities by, most importantly, allowing yourself the possibility of having abilities. You know, this is something very difficult. You tend to imagine that if you can't do something at the beginning, because we tend to see, okay, there are these two ways of looking at life. So I'm going to type out a name in the chat box. You should all look at the talks by this person. Her name is Carol Dweck. Carol Dweck is a psychologist who has been working on what's called the growth mentality, meaning that your belief that you can actually grow. Let me just double check the name. And she says this belief that you can grow is one of the most important things that you can have. The growth mindset, she calls it. So just check, go to YouTube and type Carol Dweck, the growth mindset. And you'll find wonderful talks by her about what a huge difference it makes if you believe that you are capable of growing. On the other hand, a very large number of us, and I was definitely one of that, though I've changed over the years, who tended to believe that people come born with certain abilities. So when you meet someone who is very good in first year, you think, okay, that person is a genius, I'm stupid. He is going to remain a genius, I'm going to remain stupid for the rest of our lives. Okay, that's it. But that is not true. In fact, I'm in the process of writing a recommendation for a student that I taught at Ashoka University. Okay. And what I've written in that recommendation is how much she grew over the years that I knew her. And she is not aware of it because as I point out to people, the time scale on which you improve is much, much longer than the time scale on which you experience disappointment or elation. When someone gives you a compliment or someone criticizing you, you feel elation or distress immediately. But it takes very long to improve. So you don't get to know that you're improving. Okay. You might, but you might also be unaware of it. So you should look for external observers like your teachers who will say, oh, hey, when I met you in first year, you couldn't do anything. And now look at you. So give yourself the chance. I think that's the most important thing when it comes to discovering your abilities. Oh, someone has asked me about what exams they need to pass to become a space scientist. I'm afraid I don't know anything about that. That information, I don't have the information of that kind. That information you have to find online. I'm sure if you go to the ISRO site, you'll find it. What is your view on entrance exams? Okay, Ashley's question I'm skipping over. I'll first answer the unknown's question and then I'll come to Ashley's question. What's your view on entrance exam where we have to do questions in 1 minute? Are we problem solving or just mugging questions? Well, it's a combination of the two. So there's this famous physics exam called the physics GRE, where you have to solve about 1 minute per. So if you're given a multiple choice exam, partly it can be brain work because, for example, if you're given 4 choices and 2 of the choices are dimensionally wrong, then you should be able to look at the problem from the point of view of dimensions and eliminate the incorrect answers. That is brain work. But when it comes to the precise answer, you may need a certain amount of memory. So it's a combination of memory and brain work. Though I think, if it's a contest between writing out entire answers and MCQs, there's no contest really. Writing out an entire answer gives you a much better sense of what you're doing, and it gives the person who's reading your answer a much better sense of what you understand of the whole process. So but one shouldn't be entirely negative about MCQs because it's possible to do them in a creative way. Could you explain the relationship between mathematics and physics using a specific example? Okay. And then how many barbers are there in the city of Chicago? Okay, let me give you an example. So, a very famous example. So when we study physics, we study something called Kepler's laws, which is the observations of Kepler on the motion of the planets around the sun. Okay. So there was this, not really observations, the consolidation of the observations of Tycho. There was this famous Dutch scientist by the name of Tycho Brahe who made naked eye observations of the motions of the planets. Kepler studied these observations for many years, and he came up with 3 laws, which all students of physics know, Kepler's 3 laws. Okay. Now, so what happened was Tycho Brahe noticed the motion of the planets and observed very, very well. He did the finest possible observations imaginable at that time. Kepler looked at these observations, stepped back from these observations and found patterns in them. These patterns were mathematical, but they were not the kind of they didn't provide a mathematical understanding of the process. What they provided was a mathematical description of the process. Newton came along and provided us with Newton's laws. Once he provided us with Newton's laws, which put the whole subject of mathematics on a firm mathematical foundation built on certain basic laws, you could use these basic laws and the equations of mathematics to derive Kepler's laws. This was a mathematical understanding. So you can see there are these three steps in the process. You have the observation, then you have a description of the observation, so that out of this mass of data, you have a kind of summary that captures the fundamental ideas. And then you have an explanation of that pattern from fundamental physics. And that is a mathematical process. About barbers in the city of Chicago, this is a quote by a famous scientist by the name of Enrico Fermi. He said every physicist should be able to estimate the number of piano tuners in Chicago or the number of barbers in Chicago. Essentially, what often happens to physicists is that because they work with formulas a lot, they keep working in formulas and have become completely uncomfortable with numbers. And they also become uncomfortable with something that is very fundamental to understanding and constructing a problem, which is breaking a problem down. So when you're asked how many barbers there are in the city of Chicago, at first glance, this seems like a question to which there is no answer, except in some census data. And then when you begin to think about it and you break the problem down into its constituent elements, you find that it's a very easy question to answer. One can almost trivially answer the question. So one can make an estimate very, very easily. So I think the focus there is on breaking the problem down, which is a fundamental step in all of science. Any other questions? Well, it's 10:57. I think time is perfect. We can stop.
Thank you, sir. Now, I welcome Fatima Hannat of third year BSc Physics to deliver the word of thanks.
A very good morning to one and all. It's my privilege to propose a word of thanks and acknowledge the contribution of those who made this program possible. I, Fatima Hannat of Dayapuram Arts and Science College for Women, would like to extend my sincere gratitude to Dr. Bikram Phookun for his captivating session. Next, I would like to thank Dr. Ashley N.P., volunteer in charge, Dayapuram. Next, I would like to thank our principal, Dr. Srividya ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Next, let me extend our gratitude to Mr. Vibin sir of Physics Department. Thank you, sir. I thank all the teachers who are here with us. Thank you all. And I would like to thank all the participants for being in this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannat. So hereby we are winding up. Thank you all for participating in the session. Thank you.